Welcome, everyone. My name is Tiffany Stone-Woolbrick, a STEM Education Officer at AUI, and work with NEREID. And I'm very excited to have you all here this afternoon to share this wonderful program with us. Our speaker today is Martin Ogle. Martin holds a bachelor's and a master's degree in wildlife biology from Colorado State University and Virginia Tech, respectively. And his master's thesis was on aspects of mink ecology in Virginia, the reproductive cycles, heavy metal toxicology, and aging techniques. Martin was the chief naturalist for the Northern Virginia Regional Park Authority from 1985 to 2012. Where him and his family, his wife, and his twins, Cyrus and Linnea, is that right? Linnea, moved to Louisville, Colorado in 2012, and then he founded the Entrepreneurial Earth, LLC, and Martin was born and raised much of his younger life in South Korea. So welcome, Martin. Thank you. But before we get started here, I did just want to mention, okay, it sounds like we're having a little trouble with the chat. So when I hand this over to Martin, I'm going to look into the settings and see if I can fix that. Thank you guys for letting us know. This is hosted by NEREID, the Network for Earth Space Research Innovations, Education Innovations with Data. Sorry, it's a mouthful. But we're a group of folks who like to come together in the sort of the spaces between Earth and space and research and education, innovation, big data, and see where those places overlap and just collaborate across disciplines. And we find that we have lots of very interesting conversations in these spaces between. So thank you for joining us. And if you are interested in becoming a member of NEREID, it's free. It's very easy to sign up. You'll join our newsletter. We'll read very periodically, let you know of events and different things that we're doing, like this one. So I will send that link out once we fix the chat. But right now, I'll hand this over to Martin.
Okay. Well, thank you all for being a part of this event here. I'm going to switch right over to share screen so I can get started right away. Okay, hopefully that has come to our first slide there. As is sometimes the case, the chat or the bar on the top hides some of the verbiage, but I think you all have read the program description and the title, and we'll talk about subject matter and what the Gaia Paradigm is in a little bit. But first, I actually just wanted to take 15 seconds just to say that I appreciate your taking time during the day, especially out further west you go. It's right in the middle of the day, so appreciate your time. And might just pause for 10 seconds more to have you think about what interested you about this presentation from the description. And because I'm going to start right off with why I'm doing it from my standpoint. So the big why for me for the Gaia Paradigm, and not only why I got interested in it, but why I've been a aficionado and trying to share it throughout my career, is that I really feel like we're missing context in education. Not just education, but in our educational process. There's a lot of disconnected pieces that teachers, let alone students, sometimes struggle to find relationships between. And part of that is the idea of doing interdisciplinary education. This is a term used a lot in education, but a lot of teachers have expressed to me that they find it quite difficult, at least in the present setting. So I wanted to put this diagram up. You may not see any relationship between the black blots there, but if you look at a vision of how they fit together, and then you look back at it, you probably see, in this case, the dance of life, I call it. emerging because you had a sense of how those things did fit together. And so I would posit that the Gaia theory, the science that goes with it, the view of Earth from outer space, the metaphors that we'll talk about today, that all of these offer a vision of how things fit together in a way that I've not encountered anywhere else. So I hope that works for you as well. Another aspect of not having context, but also a cause of it, is our present siloization, if you will, in society, where there's so many topics that just split off once and again. And so these that I've listed here are, of course, just a few. And the problem is that at some point it became very, very confusing. It's really hard to see relationships between anything anymore. And I kind of feel like Bill McKibben's 1992, I think it was, book, The Age of Missing Information, sums it up here. He said that we weren't entering an age of information back then, but that we were entering an age in which the information we needed was going to be swamped by uh, miscellanea. And I think that we're well into that. So then the last idea of why we need to do this, there's danger just in how we educate. In other words, we're struggling with how to educate well and with context. But I'll just throw out that, I'm also motivated by the fact that there's great danger ahead. We need to have a view of Earth systems as being alive, Earth as being alive in some metaphoric, if not real sense, and us as being a seamless part of that life. So that's why I offer this scientific and metaphoric bridge where we can bring pieces back together. So I define the Gaia paradigm, but this is just for starting sake, as the confluence of our best scientific understanding of Earth as a living system with cultural understandings, ancient and new, of human society as a seamless continuum of that system. And within this paradigm, I might also say that it's just the confluence of anything and everything we need to consider, but the ones you see in front of you are where we start and perhaps the most important. So scientifically, we're going to look at this quite a bit as we go along, but in a short phrase, James Lovelock, the progenitor of the Gaia theory, said that Gaia's Earth seen as a single physiological system. And I stress the word physiological because it'll come up a number of times. And then on the side of the metaphor, why did this scientific body of knowledge come to be called Gaia theory? I'm also going to spend a little more time on this later, but the basics of how it came to be called Gaia are so interesting and I think so important. When Lovelock worked for NASA back in the 1960s, he was charged with finding whether or not there was life on Mars. And he came to the conclusions based on the atmosphere of Mars that there was no life there. But he really came to a different conclusion that he wasn't looking for life on a planet. He was looking for whether there was a living system on a planet. And when he went back to England in the 60s, his neighbor was this gentleman who you may not know by face, but you maybe have read his book. Probably most of us on this call have read his book, The Lord of the Flies. This is William Golding. And they used to chat about this on walks and in the pubs, he said. And Golding listened to Lovelock's ideas and said that this was the most powerful idea he'd ever encountered and that it needed a powerful name. And he suggested Gaia because Gaia is the Greek goddess of earth in Greek mythology. And he said it honored the fact that Western science was rediscovering what Western culture had known at its infancy, at its mythological gut level. So that's how it came to be, and I'm going to delve into that a little bit more later. But the very first book that I ever came across on Gaia, this one here you see pictured, the very first line of the author's note was really what captivated me and could also be an explanation or a description of what this program will be. Really a work of philosophy. And she says her book is a work of philosophy in the original sense of a search for wisdom for practical guidance in human affairs through the understanding of the natural order of the cosmos to which we belong. And I'll end this first section by reading a quote from a philosopher named Mary Midgley. And in her view, philosophy is not just a pretty adornment to the real scientific business of civilization, like a bed of tulips in front of a nuclear power station. Rather, it is an essential remedy for mistaken ideas that can ruin people's lives. Midgley was obsessed with seeing things as a whole and said that integration alone is something of enormous value. This was in 1978 for our view of ourselves, for human knowledge, and for the world. So I open with those philosophical thoughts. So this first vignette, have I think 5 vignettes, is an exploration of land and people, but not with the Gaia metaphor involved yet. I want to make a point that the Gaia paradigm doesn't insist that, oh, we always have to use the Gaia metaphor or any metaphors at any given time, but that we'll see the value of that later, but that we're really looking at this interrelationship between land and people, planet and people. So I spent 27 years of my life as the head naturalist for the regional Northern Virginia regional parks, and I worked in this little circle here called Potomac Overlook Regional Park. And we had a mission statement of sorts. We organized our thoughts around promoting the understanding of interrelationships between human beings and the rest of the living system. And very early on, I believe it was 1986, we came across a grant that was given jointly by the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities and the Virginia Environmental Endowment. They had never done that before, and to my knowledge, they haven't done it since. And we got that grant, and we researched and put together a program called The Human and Natural History of Potomac Overlook Regional Park. And I just want to highlight a few of the things that we brought up in this, just to show you the beginning point, if you will, of looking at land and people. In schools in Virginia, students are required to learn these physiological provinces and a little bit about them. And the first few slides here are in those standards. Like they need to know that the fall line is the demarcation point between the Piedmont Plateau and the coastal plain. And they learn that the fall line is the head of navigation on the major rivers of the eastern United States, and that also energy in the form of falling water for mills was plentiful on the fall line. So therefore, many of our major cities on the eastern seaboard are, well, inland from the seaboard, are along this fall line, a geologic line. And actually, most of this is today I-95. But they really didn't have too many standards of learning that delved further into this. And one of them that we would cover in our programs was that when you're at a geologic boundary of any sort, you're almost definitely going to have a huge variety of diverse resources that you wouldn't have when you're within one of those provinces. And so an example here might be 2 different kind of pine trees with very different characteristics. And the dividing line between them in Virginia and down into North Carolina is very close to the fall line. And then the fact that Nadromous fish like shad would come up the Chesapeake Bay and all the way up the tidal parts of the river and spawn right at the fall line where the fresh water met the salt water. And then when you put all this together, then it makes sense that, for instance, the cultures of Native Americans, the fall line was one of the big dividing lines between different kinds of cultures, because of course their lives were defined by the resources that they had and the climate and other things. So that's just one starting example of, using a Gaia paradigm, but without using the Gaia idea or Gaia metaphor yet. And we'll jump into that. But if anyone has any early questions here or comments, be happy to entertain a few before we move on. Becky, do we have any of those?
Not yet. There was a comment from Richard that's talking about in ornithological circles, that's bird people, a huge focus is on bringing in human dimensions, and those realms are key to successful conservation. And then I was thinking as I was going through this, you're talking about that human and natural history convergence, and I think we can all think of examples in our own areas of how that's happening. You have a great example here. Don't want to hijack or relay this, but people can start thinking about that. How does the human and natural history converge in your area?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that Rich jumped in soon by your saying that there's a Richard and that he's in ornithology. He is definitely my former coworker at Potomac Overlook Regional Park. And he and I talked a lot about this in those days and have shared a few thoughts over more recent times as well.
Yeah, it makes the point too that we have people in the room that have some knowledge to share, so it doesn't have to always be questions, it can be sharing.
Absolutely. Okay, well, I didn't see the chat pick up there, so I'll proceed. But yeah, if there's any compelling questions that are timely at the point that I'm talking, you can break in, and otherwise we'll pause here and there.
Sounds great.
So the second vignette is where I start to apply what I might call a Gaian lens. And this also starts with my work experience there in Potomac Overlook. One of the duties that we had was to lead public canoe trips on the marshes in the Potomac, just south of Washington, D.C. And one day I was flying out of National Airport one day after having done one of these canoe trips. And I looked down below and saw the marshes that I'd been canoeing on the day before. And it suddenly struck me that they looked a lot like what I'd seen in a biology text very recently, too. And that is this. This is the cross section of a human intestine. And it really struck me, there's huge amounts of surface area for the exchange of gases and nutrients in both cases. And I had this dancing around in my head when I got to this conference where I first heard about the Gaia theory. And to fill out that earlier quote a bit, Gaia's Earth is seen as a single physiological system, an entity that is alive, at least to the extent that, like other living organisms, its chemistry and temperature are self-regulated at a state favorable for life. So I got this idea and that it was called Gaia and so forth, and was on my way home and got to spend a couple days in Colorado where I had gone to school earlier. And as I walked around the Rocky Mountain National Park, all these ideas were dancing around in my head. And it really occurred to me that my education had been wrong, or at least in many ways incomplete. So, for instance, we studied the geologic cycle and geology in one class, and really totally separate from biology and life cycles. But starting to come to see that on planet Earth, really these are two faces of the same things, almost in every case, not just in some cases. And it's not just that life can grow on rock like lichens, it's more that the rock and the air and the water, the organisms, including us, are all part of one system. So it's not just geobio, it's geobio, atmo, hydro, anthropo, and anything else you want to add in there. In fact, sometimes I've been throwing in no, as in noosphere. It's all one living system, and we're a seamless part of that. So when I got back home to the Chesapeake, well, she looked alive to me. Kind of a bad hair day there, but it really changed my perspective on almost everything I was doing as a biologist, a park naturalist, and frankly, as a human being. And I started to find ways in which all these ideas had been considered for not only thousands of years mythologically, but hundreds of years scientifically. So, for instance, James Hutton, who's always known as the father of geology, you'll learn that in any and all geology courses. He was actually a medical doctor, and his interest in geology was because he regarded Earth as a superorganism and thought that physiology was the science to study Earth, and the rocks in geology was part of that. So I'd never learned that before. I then was kind of cued into looking for things like that, and it just makes total sense. Luckily, probably a vast majority of what we might call Gaian science from Lovelock and Margulis and other Gaian scientists has mostly become mainstreamed. It hasn't been left behind. And in fact, it's the source of why the classes that many of us might have taken here as earth science, when you add in the work of Gaian science, it became much more systems oriented. And that's really why earth system science came to be. It's the addition and incorporation of a lot of this Gaian work that these scientists brought to us. But the metaphor has gone through cycles of receptivity, and in the United States in particular, many scientists, even now in Earth system science, are kind of standoffish to the metaphor. But I think that's a shame. It would have been a shame if we left the science behind, and I think it is a shame that we're leaving the metaphoric use of the metaphor, not a new age or cult or new religion or anything like that, just the history and the metaphoric use of Gaia behind. So here's one example. William Golding was a naval officer in World War II and emerged from World War II with a very pessimistic view of life, of human nature, hence Lord of the Flies. And even today, if you look at discussions of Lord of the Flies, you can just Google it and look at how it's being portrayed and discussed. They almost all look like this. Lord of the Flies is very pessimistic. It reflects Golding's belief that everyone is fundamentally evil. He shows what happens when evil is let free to run wild, etc. Well, it ignores the fact that for decades of his life, after he heard about this idea of Gaia, of a living system of which we're a part, and then applied his vast knowledge of mythology and writing and literature to it, that he really became an optimist. So in 1983, he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. And he said this at the reception. He said, "I came to Sweden characterized as a pessimist, though I am an optimist." And he went on to describe that a little bit. And then in his acceptance speech, these lines are contained. "Now we have been caught up to see our Earth, our mother, Gaia Mater, set like a jewel in space. We have no excuse now for supposing her riches inexhaustible or the area we have to live on limitless. We are the children of that great blue-white jewel. Through our mother, we are part of the solar system and part through that of the whole universe. In the blazing poetry of the fact we are children of the stars." So these days, even now, it's read less and less, but even as we discuss Golding and his book, we've completely lost the historical lesson that this person who we have all held up and read his book changed his mind rather suddenly, actually, and became an optimist of our life on this planet.
Martin,
Yes.
there's a Charles Yapel has his hand up in the
Yes.
and maybe he would like to ask a question. So let me.
That'd be great, and we are at this next stopping point, so please.
Great. Okay, I think I did that, Charles. You should be able to unmute yourself now.
You're unmuted, but we don't hear you.
Let's see.
Maybe you could type it in the chat if there's something preventing us from speaking live. Becky, can we arrange that?
Yes, hopefully he can hear us say that because there's the chat,
Yeah.
the question and answer are there. But Charles, you do have permission to speak, and you just have, and you're unmuted. So, oh, okay. Charles is going to ask this question later, but
Okay.
it is fine to ask. But we can wait. When you're ready, Charles, I'm going to put your hand down for now. But when you're ready, put it up there.
Okay.
All right. And right, I don't see any other questions,
Okay.
except that Robin was saying that balancing the inclusivity angle with the ideas that humans are not the only or even the most important thing enlarges our perspectives.
Yeah. Well, that's definitely kind of implicit in this. Of course, that's implicit in essentially any conservation movement like Aldo Leopold of the mid 20th century. That was one of his biggest points. All right, well, I'll move on to here. Again, we'll go through another vignette here, and then we'll pause and see if people have comments or questions. So from the previous one, I move on to suggesting that metaphors and symbols are really a seamless part of the Earth's living system. And I mean that literally, because we as human beings, we're a seamless part of the system. We evolved out of the system and we affect it and it affects us. And so the ways we think and how we talk and interact are literally a part of this living system. Oops, my ability to advance my slide. Oh, there we go. So it's not just Golding who had these ideas. And once the Gaia theory, Gaia hypothesis was out, a lot of people weighed in on it. Real big names like Václav Havel. He given the Medal of Liberty in 1994, and in Freedom Hall in Philadelphia, made a speech in which he considered the Gaia hypothesis one of two things that gave him optimism for the world. And he says, what makes the Gaia hypothesis so inspiring? One simple thing. It reminds us in modern language of what we've long suspected, of what we have long projected into our forgotten myths, and perhaps has always laid dormant within us as archetypes. That is, the awareness of our being anchored in the earth and the universe, the awareness that we are not here alone nor for ourselves alone. So that kind of echoes what we just talked about. And so he's referring to all ways of our ancestors thinking. And so these days, we're starting to pay a little bit more attention to indigenous American stories, for instance, the Turtle Island, it really makes us feel that we are on top of and part of a living being. But if you start looking, all of our ancestors all over the world had symbols to talk about our relationship to nature or earth or both. And these aren't accidents. And in fact, it's very archetypal here with the circle in four directions being some real phenomenon that all of our ancestors saw in this relationship. And so, for instance, at Potomac Overlook and sometimes in my work out here in Colorado, we might do a teacher workshop, and we're trying to get across this idea of interdisciplinary education. And I'd use a diagram like you see there, and in this case, used a quote from E.F. Schumacher, who wrote a book called Small is Beautiful, Economics as if People Mattered. And he had an entire chapter on education, which I think is very worth reading even 50 years later. All subjects, no matter how specialized, are connected with a center. They are like rays emanating from a sun. The center is constituted by our most basic convictions, by those ideas which really have the power to move us. So these are our metaphors and our cultural mores and understandings. Our most basic convictions must be true to reality. If they're not true to reality, the adherence to such a set of ideas must inevitably lead to disaster. So using this illustration, I have gone in the past, I just drew this out of my files, examples of where we might start with the basic convictions at the center and then start, say, with culture and social studies and creation stories, and then find relationships between them and science and math and art and relationships between all of them. So I'll give you this in the form of this vignette real quickly. I might start with Greek mythology, which, for until I really came across the Gaia theory, I always wondered why in high school we were studying Greek mythology. Why not Zimbabwean mythology? It was Greek. The story of Gaia's dance begins with an image of swirling mist and the black nothingness called chaos by the ancient Greeks. And Elizabeth Sahtouris, who wrote the book I referred to earlier, follows that up with an image reminding us of modern photos of galaxies swirling in space. In the myth, it is the dancing goddess Gaia, swathed in white veils as she whirls through the darkness. So why is it that we have Greek mythology in high schools? Well, our entire culture went through waves of Greek revival where we were trying to reclaim the wisdom and knowledge of our Greek Western ancestors. So math, obviously, with Pythagoras, and the natural sciences, building, there was a whole Greek revival architecture movement. I always found amazing that 2000, I think 400 years ago, the Greeks calculated the circumference of the Earth by using trigonometry ideas, and they came to within 400 miles of the true circumference of the Earth just by measuring shadows in different parts of their country. So then we at Potomac Overlook commissioned a sculpture called Gaian Energy, and the yellow piece is the incoming sunlight driving all the cycles of life, which are shown by the loops that are partly underground. And one of those loops is human life, but they all interconnect symbolically under the Earth. And then the red line is heat leaving the Earth. And this became an integral part of many of our lessons. And nearby, we had constructed a Indian circle garden with help and kind of blessing from various tribal members that were part of putting together the the Museum of the American Indian, part of the Smithsonian. And in this circle garden, we would teach these and other lessons, often in an integrated way, not as separate subjects. And then if we're talking about science, I'm just going to just lightly touch on one of the biggest figures in Gaian science, Lynn Margulis, who was already well known in her own regard for coming up with the idea of endosymbiosis, where organisms ended up living in partnerships, first within a cell becoming more complex cells, and then multicellular organisms. And she called Gaia as symbiosis, as seen from space. So you can bring in so much around just the idea of Greek, our Greek connection as a starting point, let alone any other starting point. That's why over the years, as there was some resistance to the metaphor, people would say, well, why don't you just call it Earth system science? Most of the science is incorporated into that now. And I'd say, oh, no, we have to keep the metaphor because there's so much value in that. And where and if there's been some resistance, I'll suggest something like Geosapiens. And I've done many talks with this as the title. And then during the program, of course, point out that Geo, is the same thing as Gaia. It's just two different words, versions of the same root word. You also sometimes see Ge, as the Greek goddess of Earth. And then finally, let's use the Gaia paradigm, where if we use the Gaia paradigm, we don't have to refer to the Gaian metaphor at all if we don't want, or necessarily at any given time, but we will keep in the importance of culture and metaphor and symbols and all that as a indispensable way of understanding the world. So there's that Gaia paradigm again, but you could look at it as this, but really looking at it as finding interrelationships wherever possible. As we get into the next section, I'll just close this section out by, this was a image produced for me by the Fort Collins Museum of Discovery when I did a program up there. And I kind of like it. It's just really making us a seamless part of Earth and implying that our minds also are part of that system. Okay, so we'll move on here in a sec, but are there any other thoughts or questions at this point? I'm hoping that
Richard just put this into the chat, so I'm going to read it without reading it beforehand. With a teenager about to leave the house, one complaint I've heard from him and teachers is the rigid nature of what has to be taught, when and in what way, etc. Definitely silos. I'll interrupt his comment to say, yes, as a teacher, I see that all the time. I know that teachers are frustrated by this narrow path open to them, and it's a contributing factor to how understaffed our schools are, at least here in West Virginia. What are a couple big things that advocates could do to move the needle to introduce these concepts?
Yeah. Well, I'll actually throw that open first for anyone who has ideas. I certainly have had ideas, but what do people think about that question?
Y'all can raise your hand if you have a thought or type.
Did we solve the sound thing?
I think it will go. I don't know. Yes. I don't know.
If people raise their hand, we can give them permission to speak and ask their question verbally. Or you can put it in the chat, either way. I will say that I think a big step to, I guess, to address Richard's comment, you have to get policymakers on board, and just so I think there is almost a cultural shift or a shift in perspectives that's needed to really address this. This is a large systemic problem, this idea of creating silos within our school. And it's just a checklist, a list of check boxes that teachers have to check off. And it's so long and complicated that there's not a lot of room for them to go off script. And that's not helpful to the teachers or the students. So I guess sharing that is and kind of getting people to understand that at the larger level, so that we can make new laws and initiatives at the larger scale that could alleviate that.
We're also butting up against testing and what the testers expect students to know at particular moments in time. So there's a test they take at 8th grade. What are they supposed to know then? And so that we even have this order that things are supposed to go in. And what's harder than other things. So it's still a perception, but a lot of it has to do with how they're tested and when they're tested and when they're expected to know certain things. Again, it's a systemic, like Tiffany was saying.
Yeah, that's absolutely what I see everywhere, and increasingly so. And there is, I'm going to mention at the very end here, a conference that we put together back in 2006, and a book came out of that. And in that book, there was a chapter by a gentleman named Mitch Tomashow, and he was the president of, I think it was Unity College in Maine. Don't put me on that right here, right now, but a college. And his chapter was on developing a Gaian education system. And so maybe there are some ideas in there, even though it's fairly old, that can be applied to our present challenge. And one more I'd add here is just that I think, I alluded to in the beginning, it's just time. We were facing danger. And there's been a recent resurgence. I'll say I'm lined up to do several other things on Gaia theory here in Boulder County in the next few months. And there had been a kind of a long dry spell. I think that this past summer has jarred some interest in this, going, maybe what we're doing right now is not working, and we really need to give other ideas a chance, especially ideas that have been around for a long time and are waiting to be put to use.
Catherine also contributed some ideas about informal education, starting as early as possible. I know you all can read, and it's in the chat, but it also corresponds with I've worked both in the classroom and in out of school settings, and it's much easier to integrate things in out of school settings. Kids need to get outside and off their screens anyway. And Michelle is talking about silos, manageable boundaries to bookended information. Helpful to map the overlap of the silos with a nature walk, zoo visit, or camping trip. I don't know if you want to unpack that even more. And Catherine's talking about the SEEQ school in Hawaii. I don't know what that acronym means, Catherine. Can you? Oh, and she's given us a link. Oh, and Mitchell has his hand up. And he put it. And I'm going to get Mitchell in here to talk. Mitchell, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
There we go.
Great. So just in response to the question about persuading, school districts, when it comes to Martin's point, advocating for interrelationships between the different disciplines or not having them be siloed. I think there's a good deal of evidence to support that when students are able to make cross-disciplinary links, that they do better, like they learn more. And so if a particular school district is demonstrating resistance, being able to demonstrate with evidence that students will actually do better in science if they're engaging in concepts through the field of social studies or through art and other mediums might just help with persuasion.
Yeah,
True.
definitely.
Catherine also has something to say. And Catherine, you should be able to unmute. Catherine, you were going to tell us about what?
Hi, I just wanted to jump in. Hi, Martin. Nice to see you or hear you again. Buffy Cushman-Potts was an Einstein Fellow back in 2009-10 in DC, and I believe Martin met her. She has started a school. It's actually been running, for over 10 years now, that basically focuses on systemic understanding of Earth as a system, and she's doing it in the context of Hawaiian culture as well, indigenous culture. It stands for the acronym, we call it SEEKS, and it stands for the School of Examining Essential Questions of Science. I encourage everybody to look at her website and think about that, what the things that Bartner is saying relevant to how they actually approach education. Actually, in a public school setting, it's a charter school, but it's still public. And they're doing an amazing job out there.
Thank
And
you.
I hope that we can, if there's links to things like that, and the earlier one from Hawaii and some of the research that was mentioned just a second ago, if people can put those in the chat or send them to Tiffany, it'd be good to kind of gather some of this information. And then reading the chat about STEAM and then Stamen, including art and what was the other one? I went past that, which I totally agree. Art and nature, Stamen. And I guess a point I've made sometimes is that, yeah, but we really need to include everything else too. That's what interdisciplinary is. And so I would call it supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, tongue in cheek, but saying that we really can't stop anywhere and just say, well, we're only going to do these things and other things take second fiddle. We have to understand things, how they fit together, and therefore we have to allow them in. And then one more point I'll make before we move on, just that I've talked about interdisciplinary, and however we can accomplish that, I think it does make both research sense and common sense that it will help students learn. And what I'm suggesting in this talk is that this particular metaphor at this particular time, Gaia, because it has this real history with real people that are already monstrously huge in our culture, our cultural understanding, that they form the basis by which we can bridge to all other indigenous and systems-based ways of knowing. So I hope that maybe this will come through here a little bit more as we start to finish up here. Okay. All right, so in this section where I say finding interrelationships everywhere, I'll start with this gentleman who I got to know a little bit when he was in the United States, and I heard him speak in, of all places, Sweden. He is the CEO, or I don't know, the head of Turnscape, which is a huge landscape and architecture firm in China. And Turnscape comes from two Chinese characters, earth or land, and people, the person. And so literally it's a relationship between land and people. And among many things that they produce, this is a performing arts theater in a limestone valley in China, has one of the biggest green roofs in the world, and it ventilates itself with prevailing winds down the valley, etc. But he made a very big point, saying that he's combining modern archaeological techniques with ancient Chinese insights, the feng shui philosophy. And he told us about how in ancient China, people, this 2,500 years ago, would measure shadows of the sun throughout the year, and they would see the lengthening and shortening shadows very regularly changing throughout the season, plotted them as a sine curve here, and then seeing that the seasons go in circles, would plot that on the circle, and that's the origin of the yin yang. And so this, what we think of as just a mystical symbol, really first and foremost came from understanding relationships in our surroundings. And so the classic yin yang came from that. Earlier ones look more like this because they changed with latitude, because the different shadow length throughout the season. And I have seen, and I've often used, the yin yang symbol as a symbol for negative feedback, which is really the quintessential beginning point for living systems and mechanical systems. And in mechanical systems, we might say that they are consciously designed to be negative feedback systems. And if they don't, if they don't work as negative feedback systems, they fail. And then the things that we don't design, that are everything pre-human and in our body and so forth, they're unconscious, emergent balances set up. And so the ancient Chinese philosophy really is to just see that this as the underlying principle of life. Well, then that takes us back to that quote by Lovelock in The Physiological System, and this idea of self-regulation. There's no need to envision a self-regulation that is done consciously. We can have conscious ones, but our bodies and Earth's life have been at many different set points through the eons. And so even though there's a great variety in the temperature here, it's all much less than what it would be were the atmosphere had not to have changed from its early state. We could be as hot as 290 degrees Celsius if it weren't for what's going on our planet living system-wise. And so that's because our sun has been heating up all throughout the process, which you learn in astronomy, but don't really consider elsewhere. And over these eons, Earth as a living system has co-evolved. The rock, the air, the water, the organisms, and then lately us are part of this co-evolving system. And this again is rarely considered in our schools and is so central to understanding the system. So for instance, look at, here's a mountain made out of limestone and coal. And it seems to be just this geologic abiotic thing, but actually it's entirely biotic. The limestone is the production of either microorganisms or coral in the oceans, calcium carbonate. And the coal can sometimes be almost pure carbon, and that's all from ancient atmosphere. So this mountain is largely ancient atmosphere. And it sits there as a carbon sink for eons, holding the carbon dioxide, or the carbon and the oxygen, the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Again, we're not used to talking about it in these terms, but everything is so totally integrated that this is the reality of our living system. So it all changes the atmosphere, which is akin to the membrane of a cell. A lot of certain things in, other things out, but not other things in or out. And I wanted to point out this beautiful microorganism here known as a coccolithophore, because this was highlighted in some of Lovelock's early work that gives us another great example of this coevolution. By the way, coccolithophores are huge in biomass. The milky white below the clouds there, all that is coccolithophores off of Ireland. And as it turns out, terrestrial ecologists for a long time couldn't quite understand how sulfur didn't disappear from terrestrial systems, because sulfur is very, very water soluble, sulfates, and they all ended up in the ocean. And they couldn't account for weathering from the rock, et cetera, to account for new sulfur coming into the system. Well, as it turns out, sulfur is used by ocean organisms, of course, and in huge amount coccolithophores. And the waste gas that coccolithophores produce is a gas called dimethyl sulfide. And when this is oxidized, it turns into large molecules that form some of the very few condensation points for clouds over the open ocean. Not as much dust out there. And so the rate of metabolism of coccolithophores often governs the formation of clouds and thus the reflectivity, for instance, over the open ocean. And then eventually that kind of colors all rainfall as being slightly sulfuric. And that content was what made up the difference and allowed us to see how living systems on the land could keep going without a paucity of sulfur. So again, we have everything in there, the rock, air, water, living organisms. Okay, this is basically our last vignette with one last concluding one. So just wanted to see if anyone had any thoughts or questions here as well.
There are many thoughts in the
Mhm.
chat. This has been a great conversation. And so it's hard to, I see more sharing than I see questions.
Yep, that's great.
And, and you can see if anybody has links to what they're talking about, we could put this in here too. What we're going to do is capture this chat as well as sending the recording so that we can share that with everybody. Yeah, huge lack of nature literacy among adults. Choosing to join others to act as if saving the planet is still possible. I'm paraphrasing there. Those not having an ecological education will unlikely know they live in the world of wounds. Yeah. So, and
by the way, one comment that, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I just see that Cliff didn't go ahead and comment. I'm going to
Yes, I saw the unmute. I took it. Just briefly wanted to point out with respect to dimethyl sulfide, DMS is a lot more than you might think. It made the news quite recently over the last couple of weeks. It was detected on an exoplanet, one of those things that's actually light years away from us, and it's taken as a sign of life. There's actually no known geologic process on Earth that produces DMS. It's only known as an organic or life product. So it's pretty exciting stuff to point out, and it's pretty critical to Gaia, metaphor or reality. I just wanted to throw that out, and I'll go ahead and you can take me, put me on mute now. That was my nickel.
Okay.
Yeah, no, thank you. I had not heard that, so I definitely want to look into that. And also, it reminds me to say that, and maybe you can corroborate this, that from my understanding, really astrobiology these days is not looking for life, like living organisms on a planet. They're looking for signatures like that, which indicate a living system. And so really it's become almost a de facto way of looking at life. Also wanted to say in regard to one of the comments there that says, I have to go back to it, but it said something, the population insists the Earth will simply absorb our degradation. One misunderstanding about Gaia theory that I've come across every once in a while, but I have to say if people thought about it a little bit, they quickly dismiss their own concern, and that is that somehow Gaia theory implies that we can just go about our merry way and do whatever we want because the Earth will maintain a balance whatever we do. Well, the fallacy in that is that there's always new set points that a system can jump to. And seeing that 99% of organisms have gone extinct on Earth, part of that, not all of it, but part of it is due to just we're in vastly different worlds over eons. So we have large geologic time spans that are very stable, but then inexorably as the sun heats up over those hundreds of millions of years, the system jumps to new steady states. So there's no guarantee that we'll be part of a steady state. But it does suggest that living systems will go on at least some vast period of time beyond us. Okay, I see that there's a bunch of new messages coming in. Let me go ahead and go through this last longish or longer vignette, and then maybe right before the conclusion, we can get to some of those as well. So this last one, I say, that our human mind has to be seen as part of the system. And I don't know if anyone read this book. It came out in 2007, The Weather Makers, but the author, Tim Flannery, says, does it really matter whether Gaia exists or not? I think it does, for it influences the very way we see our place in nature. A Gaian worldview predisposes its adherent to sustainable ways of living. And obviously there can be exceptions and so forth, but I think largely that is true. Then Elizabeth Sahtouris, the author of the book that I mentioned earlier, she said that once we truly grasp the scientific reality of the Gaian organism, our entire worldview and practice are bound to change profoundly, revealing the ways to solving what now appear to be our greatest and most insoluble problems. And this is where I think the rubber has to hit the road in terms of our education system. We can't just talk about Earth systems or kind of use interdisciplinary education in a vacuum. We have a big challenge. We are a part of the system, and there is no guarantee that we'll live healthily forever after. So how does this idea help us in this regard? Well, I had a friend that wrote a book in which he classified or defined human creativity as entrepreneurship, or the other way around. Entrepreneurship is human creativity. Well, to me, that means that it's literally, not figuratively, literally Earth's conscious creativity. We are. For if we evolved out of this planet and we are a seamless continuum, then our conscious thought is a seamless continuum of the planet. And somehow that to me is a very powerful underpinning for trying to figure out our way out of the mess that we've created. So I'm going to give you just one example of a vignette I use in the All Careers initiative that I've been working on, where we're trying to get schools to consider environmental knowledge as needing to be applied to any and all careers. So the first one is conscious creativity in the nitrogen cycle. So here's a nitrogen cycle illustration from the 80s. And, it's very accurate as far as it goes. Everything in there does what it is identified as doing, but it leaves out real big parts. So in the 90s, I started seeing illustrations like this that includes volcanoes and lightning, which are very big parts of the nitrogen cycle. But it wasn't until the 2000s, these are for some college notes I found, that we included things like fertilizer factories. And by this time, we knew we had to, because starting after World War II, our human contribution to the nitrogen cycle went from probably a fraction of a percent, to now well past 50% because of our fertilizer and transportation and other energy usages. So we cannot consider the nitrogen cycle without considering our activity. And this is where our conscious creativity comes in. I now see the conscious creativity of the living planet, that I am this. I know, I'll do. And here are some examples. Imagine public urinals in cities in the United States. Hard to believe or think about right now because our mindset won't allow it. This is in Amsterdam. And they have a company called Green Urine that funneled urine right to their green roofs, which they already led the world in, and then also to farms around Amsterdam. Or look at this example from Vermont, fertilizer from urine. And these folks have really grown a lot over the last few years and getting big grants and working with the Vermont legislature to change the way we deal with human waste. And then one of the most large scale and interesting ones I've recently come across is a company called Nitricity. And I'll just read their line there. It says, Nitricity electrifies and distributes the production of fertilizer. We're commercializing a breakthrough technology that produces fertilizer using only air, water, and renewable energy. We focus on fertilizers that are best for fields and farmers rather than fertilizers best for factories and freight. So that's just one little slice of examples that we talk about in the All Careers programs that I do that are me directly emanating from the Gaia paradigm. So I do have just a couple of minutes of concluding thoughts, but let's see where we are on comments or questions here.
Okay, once again, people are sharing ideas and resources
Great.
in the chat. And I don't see any hands up at the moment, and I don't see any questions in the Q&A. We're better asking questions in the chat. Yeah. Anne says Earth Overshoot Day will dispel that notion, but if anybody else knows what that means.
Earth Overshoot Day will dispel the notion that, oh, is that the one right above?
It's yeah, it can't be. Well, that's interdisciplinary too. Anne, are you still there? Can you explain what Earth Overshoot Day is? I'm unmuting you anyway. Yeah. Oh, wrong Anne. Sorry. Hold on, I can do this.
Says
Earth Overshoot Day, the day on which we will have used up all the resources available to us in a year, and on which the Earth cannot absorb any more of our waste products. And there's a website called earthovershoot.org, which sets this out. If anybody thinks that Gaia can just absorb everything that we're doing, you know, they just aren't paying attention. Just aren't paying attention. And of course, it's all the global north. The global south doesn't have overshoot days because we're taking all their raw materials and burning it or doing whatever we're doing with it up here. Anyway, it's a simple concept that people ought to be able to get their heads around.
Yeah. And I thought that's the notion you were talking about, but
Sure.
Thanks for clarifying. We had another hand up, did we?
No, that was my the wrong Anne.
Okay.
All right. David says, how to combat the dominant market-driven paradigm where profitability is maximized by ignoring the value and cost of natural resources. Yeah.
You know, I'll throw in one thing there too. I mean, it's not an easy thing, and one person's thoughts are just have to be taken with everyone else's. But this is why I feel like the All Careers initiative that I've been working on is so important. Because if we just start from the outside without any ability to change the economy, and we say we need a combat to the dominant market-driven paradigm, I think it's always going to be just received as criticism / yapping on the outside / whatever else. It's not going to work. Whereas if we start to talk about how we can do many, not all, of course, but many of the things we do in an economy in much different ways by simply paying attention to environmental principles, meaning how does the living system work and how we fit in, then I think that that idea that it can't be this present paradigm will settle in rather than being combative on the outside.
Sounds subversive. Yeah.
All right. Well,
there is one more.
Go ahead.
I don't know if you want to. What are the pros and cons of incorporating our emotional, spiritual responses to the Gaia paradigm?
Well, that's a big one, isn't it? The way I'd actually like to consider, or I like to consider that question, I guess, is how can we best incorporate our emotional, spiritual responses? And always be looking out for their validity vis-a-vis the living system and human nature, etc. Kind of having an epistemological approach. And I'll give you one example of the confusion that I think arises from our unexamined history. So spirit, the word spirit, literally, I think, and in essentially every language or languages where there is a word for spirit, stems from the word for air. And you can think that before 1800s, we did not know what was in the air. And so therefore it was this mysterious substance that we had to have for life. It was the breath of life, etc. And so if we died, we expired. When we brought in life, we respired, etc. But then once we started identifying oxygen and carbon dioxide and all those, then it became somethingized, demystified or despiritualized. But even worse, we forgot that that's what spirit was. And so trying to reconcile our spiritual beliefs with, say, what we see scientifically, in my own sensibility, doesn't even need to happen. They're self-reconciled. If we see how our ancestors thought and what they did with what they knew, and then come up with our own conclusions based on what we know today. All right. Well, I guess I'll finish up here and we'll see. I don't have the time in front of me here, but whatever time we have left, we can finish up with some discussion and then call it a day. So in kind of review, the science of Earth system science is really rock, air, water, and organisms, including us, co-evolving as a single living system. We have entered that as now a conscious part of it. And so we have new situation that has evolved on planet Earth. And so we need to pay attention to our culture, our symbols, our metaphors. I told you I'd mentioned this conference that we put together back in 2006 at George Mason University in Arlington, Virginia. I wish I had the names of all these folks, but you may recognize some. We have some of the top scientists in the world there, including Lynn Margulis. James Lovelock spoke to us via video, and a lot of others. But we also had historians and artists and a Native American gentleman and playwrights and all sorts of others considering this idea. And I want to show you who supported this idea. And all the red ones are ones that I highlighted as having some kind of educational component. The entire county supported the event. County libraries, the public schools not only supported it, but paid for 15 other teachers to go to it. The National Association of Biology Teachers supported it. And it was a huge success with over 300 people over a weekend, and a book called Gaia in Turmoil came out of it. And I guess one of my last thoughts would be to say that we can recreate this if there's interest, and recreate this as a way to really bring this idea to the fore as ways that we can improve our educational system in the face of challenges we have. So one last quote. It's a little longer, but I'll read it. It's from Mary Midgley, the woman I told you about earlier. And a subheading in a paper she wrote in 2000 was "Why Gaian Thinking is Not a Luxury." And here's what she said. The idea of Gaia, of life on Earth as a self-sustaining natural system, is a really useful idea, a cure for distortions that spoil our current worldview. Its most obvious use, of course, is in suggesting practical solutions to environmental problems. But more widely, it also attacks deeper tangles which now block our thinking. Some of these are puzzles about the reasons why the fate of our planet should concern us. We are bewildered by the thought that we might have a duty to something so clearly non-human. But more centrally, too, we are puzzled about how we should view ourselves. Current ways of thought still tend to trap us in the narrow, atomistic 17th century image of social life, which grounds today's crude and arid individualism, though there are current signs that we are beginning to move away from it. a more realistic view of the Earth, can give us a more realistic view of ourselves as its inhabitants. So that is where I will leave it. And Becky or Tiffany, maybe you can tell everyone the remaining time we have and see if we can wrap it up.
Not sure how long. I guess we have as long as people have. Some people have already had to leave for things at the top of the hour. But we did catch a question from Ken about what about the notion of the internet as hardwiring for planetary thinking? Is planetary thinking part of Gaia? The last sentence was my own addition.
Mm-hmm.
Well, go ahead. I had something to throw in.
Yeah. Well, my own take on that is that yes is the short answer. You know, the internet is an extension of our minds, and if I say personally that our minds are an extension of the living system, well, then the internet is that. But just as any mind can have mental illness, and part of that can often be through just too many inputs, you know, a kind of a tetany, then I think we also have to entertain the possibility that our whole culture is kind of going into a mental illness based on, oh, let's say social media or other things that just cause us to circumvent the careful, slow deliberation that is really our birthright, but is being overrun. So that's my own concern about that reality.
It sounds like there's great interest in this topic, and I'll just throw out to the group, if you would be interested in unpacking a few more ideas as a part 2, let us know. Just answer there in the chat. We also have, if you're not a member of NEREID, we have a website, and I'm trying to put it in the chat, and it doesn't seem to be working, but maybe Tiffany can do this. We have a newsletter and a Google group to keep in touch with what we're doing, but this is the kind of thing that NEREID does. We look at how things converge and how science and earth sciences and systems can work together. So if you're not a member, please join us. Thanks, Tiffany.
Yep.
Tiffany is our fearless leader in this whole endeavor. I don't know if I would say that exactly, but wow, thank you, Martin. This was a fascinating perspective and generated some really interesting conversation. Like Becky was saying, we're ramping up our Google group. There's been some great discussion over there as well. So if you're interested in talking with more people around topics like this, I think that's a great place to be. You can set your email settings so it comes once a day or once a week or whatever your interest level is in terms of engagement. So please join us, join NEREID, and join our Google group. And this recording will be posted on YouTube, and I will go ahead and just email it to everyone who was registered at the webinar, so you guys can have a copy of that if you want to share that with your colleagues or anyone else.
And you said that you could capture the chats, right?
I have captured it in a text file, but I think Tiffany has an even better way to do it.
Yeah, I'll have to think about how to put that on YouTube, but I certainly can share the chat along with the video when I email it to everyone. Yes.
All right.
Well, thank you again, Martin. This was amazing. I really appreciate your time and perspective. And thank you all, everyone who came. We'll see you on the next one.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.